There are men who unleash their darkest actions in the opening chaos of war. Others descend into brutality halfway through. Max Simon was different. He held back until the final chapter. At a moment when Germany's defeat was no longer a question, but an inevitability, when anyone with clear judgment was thinking about survival routes and surrender, Simon continued down a path soaked in blood. Orders for executions kept coming. Civilians were still being slaughtered. His unit operated less like a military formation and more like an organized killing force backed by armored vehicles. For these crimes, he received a death sentence. Yet that sentence never truly caught up with him. He was released, went on to live quietly, and passed away at 72 years old in a German city in 1961. This is the account of Max Simon, a Waffen-SS general responsible for the deaths of hundreds of innocent civilians across multiple countries, a man who ultimately faced almost no real consequence. He entered the world on January 6, 1919, in Brelo, today known as Roßlau, in Poland. His childhood unfolded in the era of the German Empire under the Kaiser, a society steeped in rigid hierarchy, discipline, and an unwavering belief in national superiority. When the First World War erupted in 1914, he was just 15. Too young at first, but by 1917 he joined the infantry and experienced the war's final devastating phase firsthand. When he returned home in 1918, Germany was defeated. That sense of collapse and humiliation etched itself deeply into him, as it did for many of his generation. He enlisted in the Reichswehr, the limited army allowed under the Treaty of Versailles, and spent the 1920s as a professional soldier. At that stage, he was not driven by political ambition. He was simply a man in uniform, serving a weakened nation. Then the political landscape shifted. As the Nazi regime rose and began restoring military strength, Simon saw opportunity. In 1933, he joined the SS and moved into the SS Verfügungstruppe, which would later evolve into the Waffen-SS. At 34, after a lifetime in military service, he had found his place within a force determined to rebuild German dominance at any cost. Through those 1930s, his ascent was steady. He was not flamboyant, nor particularly charismatic. Instead, he was disciplined, methodical, and efficient. He understood command, logistics, and battlefield organization. Above all, he demonstrated unwavering loyalty. The SS demanded total obedience and ideological commitment. Simon delivered both without hesitation. He participated in early wartime campaigns, Poland in 1939 and France in 1940. During this time, he was part of the Totenkopf Division, one of the most feared SS units. Originally formed from concentration camp guards, this division was built from individuals chosen specifically for their willingness to execute the harshest elements of Nazi ideology. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were deeply indoctrinated, aware that their mission extended beyond combat into systematic destruction. In May 1940, during operations in France, the division carried out one of the earliest recorded massacres in the Western Campaign. In the town of Le Parade, roughly 100 British soldiers from the Royal Norfolk Regiment were captured. They had surrendered, were disarmed, and should have been protected under the Geneva Convention. Instead, they were lined up against a wall and cut down by machine gun fire. 97 men died. Only 2 survived, hidden beneath the bodies of the fallen. At that time, Simon held a senior position within the division. He operated within the same structure, surrounded by the same culture that allowed such an atrocity to happen. The environment that produced Le Parade was the same one shaping his actions. Then came a new phase, far more brutal. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa began, launching the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The Totenkopf Division moved east with the advancing forces. What unfolded there was unlike any previous battlefield. From the very beginning, it was not just a war between armies. It was a campaign defined by systematic annihilation. The directives handed down to German troops on the Eastern Front left no room for ambiguity. This was not warfare bound by traditional rules. Political officers, commissars, were to be executed immediately upon capture. Jewish civilians were to be transferred to the Einsatzgruppen units. Any sign of partisan resistance triggered collective punishment. Entire villages suspected of offering support were marked for destruction. Their homes burned, their people eliminated. Amid this ruthless framework, Max Simon led his regiment through some of the harshest combat of the Eastern Campaign. In 1942, during the battle around the Demian Pocket, his division found itself surrounded by Soviet forces for months. Cut off, freezing, and starving, they endured a brutal winter under constant pressure. Supplies were scarce. Violence was constant. Survival itself became a daily struggle. Yet in this desperate situation, Simon's leadership drew approval from his superiors. His ability to hold the line under extreme conditions strengthened his standing within the SS hierarchy. Promotions followed. Recognition came. But on the Eastern Front, battlefield effectiveness and atrocities were never separate realities. They existed side by side, carried out by the same formations in the same regions. The record left behind by the Totenkopf Division reveals a pattern of violence against civilians and prisoners of war. Entire communities reduced to ashes, captured soldiers executed without mercy, civilians killed in retaliatory actions designed to instill terror. Simon was not detached from the system. He operated within it, commanded inside it, and contributed to its function. As a senior officer, he was part of an organization where such acts were not exceptions. They were routine. By 1943, Simon had risen to command the Totenkopf Division itself. Under his direction, the unit fought in the massive clashes that defined the Eastern Front during 1943 and 1944. Battles around Kharkov tested the limits of endurance. As German forces were gradually forced backward toward the borders of the Reich, prolonged defensive engagements became the norm. His performance earned him multiple decorations. Among them were the Knight's Cross and its higher distinctions. Within the Waffen-SS, he was viewed as a capable and reliable divisional commander, efficient, disciplined, and effective in both offense and defense. Then came a turning point. In the summer of 1944, Simon received command of the 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, Reich IV SS. This unit was deployed in Italy. It was there, on Italian soil, that he would commit the crimes that would later bring him to trial. Italy in 1944 was a battleground of chaos for German occupation forces. Allied troops were steadily advancing north along the peninsula. Behind German lines, the partisan movement grew stronger, striking from the shadows. Resistance fighters disrupted supply routes, ambushed patrols, and kept constant pressure on occupying units. The German response was calculated and merciless. Official policy demanded reprisals on a massive scale. For every German soldier killed by partisans, civilian hostages would pay the price. The ratio shifted depending on circumstances, but it was always brutally excessive. 10 civilians, 50 civilians, sometimes even more for a single German death. This was not unofficial brutality. It was sanctioned, encouraged, enforced, and units like Simon's division carried it out with chilling efficiency. Between September and October of 1944, the 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division launched a series of operations in the Eni mountain region of northern Italy. Officially, these actions were described as anti-partisan sweeps. In reality, they became some of the most thoroughly documented massacres committed by German forces in Western Europe. The most horrific of these took place at Marzabotto. Located in the Eni Mountains, south of Bologna, the village of Marzabotto, along with nearby communities such as Grissana and Monzuno, became the center of a systematic killing campaign. In the closing days of September and the early part of October 1944, SS troops under Simon's command moved through these areas. What followed was not combat. It was extermination. Soldiers entered homes, dragging residents outside. They forced people from hiding places. Many had sought refuge inside a local church, believing its walls might offer protection. It did not. Men were shot. Women were shot. Children were shot. Elderly individuals who could barely move were killed without hesitation. Grenades were thrown into cellars where families tried to hide. Inside the church itself, a priest was murdered at the altar. Infants were not spared. Pregnant women were not spared. Those too weak to flee were executed where they lay. By the time the operation ended, approximately 770 civilians had been killed across Marzabotto and the surrounding villages. It stands as the largest single massacre of civilians carried out by German forces in Western Europe during the entire war. And at the head of the division, responsible stood Max Simon. The directives that led to the operation passed directly through Max Simon's authority structure. The soldiers who carried out the killings wore the insignia of his division. The justification, framed as military necessity under reprisal doctrine, was enforced by the very unit he commanded. Responsibility did not sit at the edges. It pointed straight at him. What happened at Marzabotto was not distant from his control. It was tied to him in the clearest possible way. And yet, even after that, the violence did not stop. By April of 1945, Germany stood on the edge of total defeat. Allied forces were advancing across northern Italy and pushing deep into German territory. The outcome of the war was no longer uncertain. Collapse was imminent. Still, Simon's troops carried out another massacre, this time in Czechoslovakia, in a place known as Frog, also identified by its Czech name. Civilians were once again targeted and killed in a retaliatory action ordered under his command. It was April 1945. Within weeks, Hitler would be dead. Within a month, Germany would surrender. Yet, even in those final days, Simon continued issuing orders that led to civilian deaths. On May 8, 1945, Germany capitulated. Simon was taken into custody by Allied forces soon after. In 1947, he stood trial before a British military tribunal. The accusations centered on his role in the Marzabotto massacre and other crimes carried out by his division in Italy. The case against him was overwhelming. Survivors from Marzabotto gave testimony. Official records were examined. The chain of command was clearly traced. There was no ambiguity left. On May 24th, 1947, the verdict was delivered. Max Simon was found guilty of war crimes. The sentence? Death. But the story did not end there. Like many cases in the years following the war, the punishment was never carried out. His death sentence was reduced to life imprisonment, and even that did not last. In 1954, Simon was released. 7 years. That was the total time he served. 7 years for the killing of approximately 770 civilians in Marzabado alone. 7 years for the additional victims across Italy and Czechoslovakia. 7 years, and then freedom. He returned to West Germany. He settled in Langres in Bavaria. There he lived quietly, away from the spotlight, until his death on February 1st, 1961. He was 62 years old. Meanwhile, the people who survived Marzabado were still alive. The families of those 770 victims in the mountain villages continued to carry their loss. The man responsible for ordering those deaths had spent only 7 years behind bars, and then lived the rest of his life as a free man. The Italian government repeatedly demanded his extradition so he could face justice on Italian soil. Each request was denied by West Germany. Why? The answer lies in the complicated reality of the post-war world. Political priorities shifted. The Cold War reshaped alliances. Western powers focused on rebuilding West Germany as a strategic partner, rather than pursuing every war criminal to the fullest extent. At the same time, there was deep resistance within West German society to confront the crimes of the recent past. All of these forces came together, and they shielded Max Simon. But Marzabado did not forget. The village stands today with a memorial dedicated to the 770 lives taken in September and October of 1944. Every year, ceremonies are held, names are preserved, stories are passed down to new generations of Italian students. The massacre remains one of the defining atrocities of the German occupation in Italy, and Max Simon's name remains tied to it permanently. What must be understood from his story is this: he was not an exception. He was not a lone figure who stepped outside orders in a moment of madness. He was shaped by the SS system itself, a structure that trained, promoted, and rewarded men who treated the killing of civilians as a legitimate instrument of war. Marzabado was not chaos. It was not loss of control. It was deliberate, organized, carried out over several days by soldiers following orders through a clear chain of command that led directly to Simon. And, after everything, he served 7 years. Then lived another stretch of years in freedom. He died in his own bed. While the families of 770 murdered civilians in the E9 mountains carried that loss for the rest of their lives. That is the full weight of Max Simon's story. The crimes themselves and the absence of justice both matter. Both must be remembered. If we choose to remember only the violence, we miss the failure that followed. If we remember both, we preserve the truth, and we honor those who were lost.